beginning, there was nothing. Nothing but power. Laying beneath the sand of the desert, waiting to be found. For an eternity, no one found it. Until this day. Hsieh looked deep enough to see below the sand. She drew upon the power and turned the desert into an oasis. Everything she touched flourished and came to life. She danced, and rivers ran where her bare feet fell. She basked in the glory of it all, and the world drew its joy from her. But then there was Raeq, who also knew of this power. She stood aside and watched as Hsieh created beauty. Soon, Raeq declared she was bored with Hsieh's creations. The flowers, the colors, and these eternally joyful creatures were all too plain. Raeq thought she could change it up a little bit. Nothing too drastic, just a little tweaking. She decided to have a little fun, to make things more interesting. Raeq stared down at the blood on her fingertips, her eyes widening with excitement. Her breath came in short gasps. She could feel her own blood rushing in her veins, and the power filling her. Oh, the rush. She had never felt anything like this before. Before the blood seeped into the sand, she knelt down to touch it. The surge of intoxication shot through her veins once again. She sighed in contentment. Intrigued, she reached her hand out to try something. Raeq smiled with wild happiness. Blood wasn't pouring at all. But the rush and the excitement of power in her body and mind were gone within seconds. It left her feeling deprived. More. She wanted more. Hsieh's world was utterly desecrated. Raeq's obsession with blood and its power left ashes in her wake. She danced among them, her eyes lit up with happiness. But there was one who remained. Raeq squinted her eyes to see him. Hsieh had given him a name, him alone among all the others. Simka. What a ridiculous name, Raeq thought. She smiled, baring her teeth. Simka turned and tried to flee from her hunger, but he failed and fell at her feet. Then Raeq looked around. There was nothing left, and nothing to do. The world was barren once again. Raeq looked at her hands as the blood seeped into her skin. Her robes now held shadows, but it wasn't enough. She needed more. As Raeq skipped away through the ashes, searching, Simka lay on the ground, broken and motionless, but alive. With every remaining ounce of strength, Simka pulled himself up to stand on his shaking legs. He stumbled through the wasted world, grieving and hoping. Where was Hsieh? Simka lay on the sand. It It was a final and futile defiance. Trying to raise his head, his eyes still searching for Hsieh, for hope on the horizon. And then a single breath whispered out of his lips. With it, his life left his body. There was nothing left but absolute silence. The once golden sands lay dark with decay as waves of black roll under the heavy sky. The wind mourned through the ashes, lifting the remains of life into the air in a morbid dance. Hsieh stood on the edge of the ashen world. She gasped for breath as sadness wrapped its fingers tight around her chest. How could this happen? What had Raeq done to cause this horror? She went through the ruins slowly, like a ghost. Blackened flowers crumbled at her touch. She forced herself to look at the desolate remains of her own creations. With every ruin she passed, each tear fell harder. There was no answer for this, no words to make it right. Grief poured out of her heart like water from a rock. Suddenly, she saw a body in front of her. Simka? As she gathered his body in her arms, she filled the silence with cries of grief and anger. Hsieh laid Simka's body back down on the ground. Now that her grieving had ended, it was time to make things right again. One single green spring poked its head timidly through the ashes, growing slowly. A sliver of life, starkly vivid against the darkness from which it had sprung. It grew before Hsieh, quickly blossoming into an explosion of colorful flowers. With one hand steadying the sprouting life, and the other on the utter desolation, she conjured new life from the ruins. The river once again began to run merrily. rushing along its now dry path through the desert sand, washing away the darkness that once was. Hsieh, tired but more alive than ever, stood for a moment to watch nature's bounty blossom. Then she knelt once more, continuing to heal the damage that was dealt. Finally, Hsieh approached the body of her friend. She knelt beside him and rested her hand on his heart. For a long time, nothing happened. Hsieh clenched her jaw, determined, continuing to draw from the power within her. Hsieh took him by hand and said, "My child, get up." Suddenly, a strong breath filled Simka's lungs and his eyes flew open. Hsieh helped him stand. Laughing with delight, Simka danced around her, leaping and falling like a child at play. Hsieh began to rejoice as well, and the two filled the air with life. His feet kicked ashes into the air, where the wind caught them and carried them far away. The world danced around Hsieh as she watched in wonder and relief. Yet even as she rejoiced, she also kept watch for Raeq's return, because whatever drew Raeq to destroy it in the first place would surely draw her back again. As Hsieh surveyed her work, she began to notice something. Everything that had been restored was not only alive again, it was fuller and stronger. The flowers bloomed larger and more beautifully. The river almost overflowed its banks at every turn. The creations leapt higher, moving without failing or faltering. Everything she had restored came back to life with more power. Now Hsieh realized how to defeat Raeq. As if the very thought had summoned her, Raeq appeared behind Hsieh. Her robes whipped about her in the wind. Her eyes widened at the sight of Hsieh's restored world, and a sneering smile crept across her face. Her fingers twitched eagerly. She approached Hsieh. Hsieh turned as well, keeping Raeq in sight. They paced around each other like two jungle cats, waiting to pounce. It is finished. With these last words, Hsieh crumbled to the ground, giving up her spirit. She was dead, blood soaking into the ground beneath her. Raeq, laughing delightedly, danced off into Hsieh's beautiful world. The creatures fled, screaming in fear. Darkness spread out from her, turning the sand black where her feet fell. But the ground beneath Hsieh's body, where her blood soaked the sand, was gold again, and her eyes open. Slowly Hsieh rose as the air filled with the screams of her creations. Fury laced every muscle in her body, setting her jaw rigid and her eyes on fire. The gold beneath her feet swelled around her, pulsing and rising in waves that rippled out with every step she took. She moved toward Raeq, who turned and froze, staring at Hsieh in disbelief, awe, and fear, as Hsieh's power churned and rose around her. There was no battle, gold light rose like a tide, slamming into Raeq with all the force of Asah's anger. Raeq's ashen skin cracked as teeny fissures of light broke her apart from the inside out. One shrill scream ripped itself from her lips, and then Asah's power shattered her into nothing but ashes. Asah's shoulders then sagged. She stared at the ground where Raeq fell with sadness. Power continued to ripple out from her, settling into the sand as it reached to redeem the far stretches of Raeq's desolation. Finally, the last of the shadows disappeared. Asah raised her head, watching as her creations moved closer to her with awe and gratitude on their beautiful faces. Asah drew in a breath, letting it out again in a quiet sigh. It is finished. Now let there be peace.